You are about to hear Dr. John R. Lee, one of America's leading authorities on menopause and hormone replacement therapy. Dr. Lee is a cum laude graduate of Harvard University. He received his medical training at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Lee has authored many articles as well as 3 books. His most recent book, What Your Doctor May Not Tell You About Menopause, is based on his 15 years of using natural progesterone hormone cream to treat female patients having a variety of hormone-related problems. Dr. Lee used natural progesterone to treat pre- and post-menopausal women suffering from hot flashes, depression, low thyroid, fibrocystic breasts, water retention, weight gain, and loss of libido. He also found that natural progesterone cream helped prevent and reverse osteoporosis. Here is Dr. John Lee.
Let me tell you, before we get started, a little more about myself. You might wonder why a family doctor goes around giving talks about progesterone. And I want you to know that I was a fairly, if you don't mind, I hate obstructions. I was a fairly middle-of-the-road, conventional family practitioner in Mill Valley for a number of years. And it is, when I look back on it now, it's quite a surprise that I find myself where I am with chutzpah or whatever it is to tell you what I think you ought to know about the hormones. But I gradually changed in my practice because I had a greater interest in preventive medicine, how to help people not get their stroke, or what they ought to do in their life so their diabetes didn't get too bad, or to prevent a heart attack or prevent their hip fracture and so on. It struck me that this was part of the function of being a doctor, is to try to help people so they don't get the things in the first place. Later on, as I was more successful in my practice in doing this, and I'd make rounds at our hospital, the nurses would say, "Gee, Dr. Lee, we haven't seen you as often as you used to." And I say, "I know, my job is to keep people out of the hospital. And if one of my patients ends up in the hospital, it's probably because I screwed up somehow and didn't know enough." But it was a long learning process, because I think if you talk to any doctor, even in medical school today, they really do not teach a whole lot about how to keep people well. In fact, one time at a PTA meeting, when they were talking about lunches for the students, they'd invited me to talk about the relationship of the things that we eat to getting heart attacks later on, and that it starts in quite an early age. At age 12 or 14, they can see the plaques start developing in arteries. And so my idea was that they should serve a diet which was anti-atherogenic. And the other speaker was a young professor from the University Medical School, San Francisco, in pediatrics. And he said, "Well, in real medicine, we don't think you should change anybody's diet or recommend any specific diet until you know what disease you're treating. You have to wait till they have a heart attack, and then you tell them what they should have been eating for the previous 40 years. And you see, in my family history, my father had his first heart attack at 44 and died at 49 when I was 15. And his brother died at 48 of a heart attack, and his other brother died at 46 of a heart attack, and my only male cousin had a heart attack at age 38. And I'll be 68 in November, and I'm either doing something right or else I was adopted. So at any rate, in my practice, a change occurred in the mid-70s after I'd been in practice over 20 years. And the change was that it was recognized by everybody that estrogen was the main, if not the only, cause of cancer of the uterus, and it increased the risk to a woman by a factor of 8 times or so. They were 8 times more likely to have cancer of the uterus if you gave them estrogen. Unopposed estrogen is the only known cause of cancer of the uterus. And I'd been in practice long enough that I had many patients who had osteoporosis. And in those days, we had a new way of testing. We had the dual photon bone absorptiometry, or then later the dual energy X-ray. And we could actually tell with quite good accuracy, within 95, 96%, the bone mineral density of somebody, and we could follow how good their bones were. So my entry into this field of re-examining hormone replacement therapy occurred because of my patients with osteoporosis. All right? I didn't start out to create a revolution. I just started out to try to find a way to help people who had osteoporosis and couldn't take any estrogen because of contraindications, such as a previous history of breast cancer or cancer of the uterus or obesity or diabetes or previous vascular disorders. So here I was. I could offer them estrogen, but it might put them at more risk of disease, or I could withhold the estrogen and they would have more risk of osteoporosis and eventual hip fracture. This struck me as something that there's something wrong here with this system. I was at that time I was still connected with the California Medical Association. I was a delegate to the CMA meetings. I was on the board of directors of our medical society. I was president of the family practice group. I was editor of the bulletin. I was a very good conventional doctor. And I saw that the CMA, the California Medical Association, was having a weekend meeting on how to deal with this dilemma of whether to use estrogen or not. So I went to the meeting. It costs, you know, about $100 to sign up for these meetings, or $300 for, they make you pay to go to the meetings to get more education. So I went to the meeting, and the answer to the dilemma of whether to use estrogen or not was leave it up to the patient. Tell her both sides of the question, make her decide, and then she can't sue you for whatever happens. If she goes and gets the hip fracture, it's not your fault. If you give her the estrogen and she gets a cancer of the uterus, it's not your fault. And that was the big advice. Well, that wasn't good enough, so it happened that I was giving a talk at a unconventional medical meeting called the Orthomolecular Medical Society. Linus Pauling was there giving a talk, a bunch of wonderful people were there giving a talk, and I was giving a little talk on hypoglycemia. I'd done some studies on hypoglycemia in the adrenal gland, the conversion of sugar into adrenaline and so on. And here was a speaker, Ray Peat, a biochemist from Oregon, who's telling us about progesterone. And I'm going to assume that you all know about estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone are the two of the three main sex hormones, testosterone being the other one. All humans make all three. Women make more estrogen and more progesterone, and men make more testosterone. And these two hormones, estrogen and progesterone, are made in large part by your ovaries. And the main function of these hormones is to prepare you to become pregnant, carry the baby to term, and deliver the baby well-formed and well-nourished. And these two hormones are essential in that. Estrogen builds up the bloody lining in your uterus, and progesterone causes the lining to mature each month and make it accessible to the fertilized egg, and will hold in the bloody lining for 10 or 12 days, and then will quit, and the quitting allows you to shed the lining, and then you start over the next month. So I heard Ray Peat tell us, there were about 400 doctors there, saying, look, at menopause, when the ovaries cut down on their hormone production and estrogen drops about 40% and progesterone drops to 0, why is it do you only replace estrogen? Progesterone has all sorts of other functions. It's good for brain cells. It helps the thyroid hormone work. It's good to help the woman use fat for energy. It helps libido. It helps all these things he listed. And I thought, wow, he's asked a good question. Why do we use only estrogen instead of giving both hormones back when your ovaries cut out making them? So I got a hold of Ray Peat, and he gave me about 60 or 90 references to read, and sure enough, the references supported what he said exactly. And I thought, why didn't I know this? Did I fall asleep during a class in medical school? And because I didn't know all this about real progesterone. And then I talked to my colleagues about it, and it turns out they were as ignorant as I was. We couldn't all have fallen asleep. It turns out in medical school they didn't teach about real hormones, the real natural hormones that your body makes. It was all about how to replace the pharmaceutical drugs that mimics for these hormones. and nothing about progesterone. So in my practice, I told these patients with osteoporosis that they couldn't take estrogen. They should stay on their diets. They should stay on their calcium, stay on their vitamin C, their vitamin D. They should do the exercises, avoid smoking, do all the things that you're supposed to do for osteoporosis. But they could go to the health food store and they could buy a cream that Dr. Pete had told us about, Ray Pete had told us about. You could buy a cream which had sufficient progesterone so that a little application, a little dab every day, would give you the same progesterone that your ovary should be making. 10 or 15 milligrams a day. That's all the ovary needs to make for all these wonderful things that happen. And so I did that, and I followed with annual bone mineral density tests, and by the third year, I may not be the quickest kid on the block. It took me 3 years to see that the bones were all getting better. My patients in 3 years, their bone mineral density had increased by on the average of 15%. It reversed osteoporosis. Estrogen does not reverse osteoporosis. Estrogen delays bone loss. I'll just say a little thing about osteoporosis, then we're going to show you some graphs here. Bones are living tissue, just as skin, hair, red blood cells, tissues, connective tissue, living tissue. It's made, lasts for a while, it's unmade, and then it's made anew. It's constantly being renewed. Unlike teeth. Teeth are made before you're born, and once you lose the 2 sets you have, you're done. If you break a tooth and hold it together, it will not knit together. If you break a bone and hold the ends together, it knits together. It's live. It's got living cells in it. In fact, it's got 2 sets of cells. One is called osteoclast, with a C, osteoclast, and one is called osteoblast, with a B. The osteoclasts go rummaging around through the bone structure. There's little channels in there called canaliculi, and they run around and they find bone that was made some time ago and has become over-crystallized and more likely to break. And those osteoclasts move in and dissolve that part of bone away. It's called resorption. Actually leaves behind a little space. And right on the heels of the osteoclasts come the osteoblasts. And they move in and they make new bone where the old bone had been. And the new bone they make is stronger than the bone that they took away. You all follow that? And this goes on all the time. And the rate at which this happens is truly amazing. For the long bones in your arm and your leg, you have 100% replacement of your bone structure in 12 to 14 years. 100%. It's all new bone. Isn't that amazing? As long as this system keeps going. And on the trabecular bone, which doesn't have to have a tensile strength, it's the backbones in your heel bone and your patella, it's got spaces in it. Nature makes it a lighter bone because it only has to support compression. And that has a turnover time of only 4 or 5 years. Brand new bone every 4 or 5 years. Absolutely amazing. So what is osteoporosis? Osteoporosis is a condition where new bone formation isn't keeping up with loss of old bone. The function of estrogen is to slow up the loss, but it does nothing for new bone formation. The function of progesterone is to stimulate the osteoblast to make new bone. Now let me just run through a couple slides having to do with osteoporosis. This is the classical picture that you see, the spine. And the classical picture is as a woman ages, she shrinks in height. In fact, measuring your height is the most sensitive test for osteoporosis that you might have. It's the most cost-effective test. Anyone can measure their height, and from the time it starts going down, you do have osteoporosis. The bones actually kind of crunch together because of the forces of how it holds up the body and where the weight of the body is and the strength of the flexors versus the extensors. It pulls people over as the bones crunch together, and that's typical. You see women like that all the time, and that's osteoporosis. It happens to be epidemic in the United States. This is from Lancet. Lancet is not only the best medical journal published in the English language, it's published in London, by the way, but it also has a sense of humor. Doesn't that look like Pac-Man? That's Pac-Man, and that's the osteoclast. And it's coming along and it's eating out some old bone. It's called resorption, remember? And it leaves behind that hole called a lacuna, and along come osteoblasts. And they come in and they fill up with new bone, and then it rests for 4 or 5 years, and then the process repeats. So this is going all the time. So every year of your life, 20 to 25% of the bone in your backbone and your heel bone is being restored. And in 4 or 5 years, it'll be 100% restored, but in the meantime, some of it has become old, so it keeps on going. Next slide. All right, now this is an example. This lady, she was 71 years old, and she called me from Pennsylvania. It's a lady that I had met at a nutrition conference at the EPA in Washington, D.C. about 10 years before, and she woke up one morning, and this is her bone mineral density. She'd had a compression fracture. When you do bone mineral densities of the backbone, this number should be over 0.9 or 0.95. A good one would be 1.10, like $1.10. And so sound as a dollar to me means that the numbers will be 1.00, just like a dollar in cents. So she's down to about 44.5 cents out of $1's worth of bone. She's lost over 50% of her bone mass. She had gone through menopause about 20 years before. She hadn't been on any progesterone. She hadn't been on any hormone. She was a health nut. She ate right. She exercised. She looked great. Everything was fine, except she was having a silent osteoporosis. You see, osteoporosis is silent until something breaks. And in this case, one of her bones in her back broke, and she had terrible pain. And she had heard that I had written a paper about osteoporosis and was working on a book. Her husband's a doctor, her son's a doctor, and of course she had a doctor. And that doctor got her to an orthopedist. And of course a radiologist was involved. And she told them she's going to get some progesterone cream, and she's going to use that, and her bones will get better. And all the doctors, including her husband and her son, said, that's craziness. You can't absorb hormones through the skin. Progesterone has nothing to do with bones. Nonsense. This woman is tough. And she did it anyway. And her husband made her get a bone mineral density test every 8 months to show that it was stupid and foolish and she's wasting time. And look what happened. 446, 516, 0.55. She's gained 11 points on a scale starting at 44.5, and that is about a fourth. She has about a 20% increase of bone mass in 16 months. All she did was add a little dab of this cream. This is another patient, 72. Now you'll notice I chose those that are up in their 70s because in every book on osteoporosis you will read that once you're past 70, nobody can do anything for your bones. Now this is October 82, June 83, June 84, June 85. This is a lady whose bone mineral density was there. She broke her arm trying to lift her sick husband off the floor when he fell. She went to a doctor who sent her to a specialist who said she had to use fluoride treatment. Now at this point I have to tell you something else about myself. Back in the mid-70s when I was learning more about prevention, remember, I started teaching a class at our local junior college. They wanted a class for people who wanted to learn how to stay well. And I have to tell you, the best way to learn a topic is to try to teach it. And it's a 16-week class that I devised in 1975, and I'm still teaching it today. Every year from September through March, I teach a class that meets on Thursdays for those 2 quarters, and it is booked up for 3 years ahead. I teach a class, I chose a room, the class got too big, and when you get 300 people in a big dark auditorium in the middle of the afternoon, I discovered that's not the best way to teach. And so I do it in a room that holds only 90 people and about 120 crowd in. They stand around the walls and they sit on the steps, and they do this every Thursday afternoon for two quarters. And they come and take the class every 3 or 4 years to see if I've learned anything new. The one requirement for the class is that they cannot become my patient, because I didn't want anybody to say, Dr. Lee is teaching the class because he's trying to advertise himself. So they couldn't become my patient. Well, this lady was in my class, and when her doctor said, you have to use the fluoride treatment, she said, oh no, Dr. Lee explained that fluoride is toxic to bones, and it might end up with a slightly higher bone mineral density because it forms calcium fluoride crystals and things like that. But the bone that is made is really not superior, high-quality bone, and the actual fracture rate increases. And that happens to be true. Okay, so he said, well, if you're not going to take the fluoride, you should go see Dr. Lee. Well, you see, that made it a referral. So that was all right. So I told her about the progesterone, and there you go. There's this nice rise. And now she's up over 0.9. And you see, this is now 15 years ago. So she is now, what, 87? She's still living alone. Last year she drove up to Canada to see her younger sister who has Alzheimer's. She's still tending her garden. She still drops me letters every once in a while telling me what her doctors are doing. See, I retired in 1989 from practice. And my wife says, yeah, look, I'm retired. I'm never home. I'm out doing... Next slide. So it works on people over 75. Okay. Now, this is the woman from Pennsylvania. I had them a little out of sequence. This is the same woman. This is the same chart. And the week before, just a couple days before I left, her husband sent this to me. And he said, you're going to be surprised. He said, because there was a year in here where she didn't improve. And he said, guess what? Her doctor thought he could help her by giving her some injections of cortisone. Now, let me tell you about how hormones work. Hormones work by binding with receptors. Hormones are like messengers. They come, but you have to have a messenger receiver. And those are called receptors. So when progesterone floats into a cell, it finds its receiver, and the two of them together then go to the nucleus where the chromosomes are, and they find the right gene site. Out of all the hundreds of thousands of gene sites on your 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, it finds the right one and drops the message. Isn't that amazing? And the message is, for osteoblast cells, make new bone. That's the message of progesterone. The message of cortisone, which happens to use the same gene site because, as you'll see later, the molecule is so similar, they use the same gene site. The message from cortisone is, don't do anything. It inhibits action. That's why you rub it on when you've got poison oak. It stops the poison oak reaction from occurring. This is why you give it to people with inflammatory arthritis. It stops the inflammation. It stops the cell from working. And in this case, it stopped the osteoblast from making new bone, and she actually went down during that time. She had 3 shots, 3 injections of long-acting cortisone, and finally her husband said, this is ridiculous. Look what's happened. So she quit the cortisone, and look what happened. Up they go again. And now they're also doing the hip bones at the same time now and doing the test every 8 months. And look, everybody at the hospital is now interested in this lady. It's the first lady they've seen that actually has reversal of osteoporosis. Everybody's excited. The radiology technicians, all the women who work there, they want to see, let's see how she does this time. The radiologist has written me a letter, her husband has written me a letter, her own doctor has written me a letter. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it. Her son hasn't written me a letter yet. He's a little too close to the medical school education that he had. But she called and said he is now using it in his practice. So don't let anybody tell you that progesterone doesn't work. It works fine. The bones do need it. And it is, the lack of progesterone is the chief cause of the osteoporosis in the United States. It is not a calcium deficiency disease. You can theoretically make osteoporosis by denying somebody calcium. But the calcium intake in the United States is one of the highest in the world. So the people who have osteoporosis have plenty of calcium. It's their bone cells that cannot make good bone out of it. That's the cause. Next slide. This next one is 63 patients that I took from my files when I retired in 1989. They were current patients, and the black represents where they were when I first saw them, and the white represents where they were 3 years later. Now you see, when you get up at the high level, you don't get much improvement because the bones are at the good level. You see where they are? They're over here at 1.2, at $1.20. They're fine. They don't need to grow. So the purpose of progesterone there for these women is just to maintain the good bone. Now, every once in a while, like these, should have had a good result, and they didn't. That's where you get to be a doctor. There are many factors in bone building. There's exercise, there's vitamin D, there's calcium, there's magnesium, there's phosphorus, there's all these things. I could list 40, 50 things that go on in bone building. This is where you have to be a doctor and find the missing factor. It's easy to give the progesterone. It's easy to replace that factor. But if the bone still doesn't grow, then there's another factor missing. And in one of these, the lady was from another clinic who came to see me about her bones. And she had bad bones, you can see. I gave her progesterone, and it didn't get better. And I couldn't figure it out, and I finally talked to her, and she said, I don't think I'm absorbing the calcium. And I said, why would you say that? She said, well, they're giving it to me in a pill, a white pill. I said, yeah? She says, well, when I go to the bathroom, I can look in the toilet, and there it is. The pill was passing through without being digested at all. And I said, I think you're right. I don't think you're absorbing the calcium. And she said, could you give it to me in a liquid? I said, I could, but then we'd never know. So she said, well, what can cause this? I said, well, if you don't have any hydrochloric acid in your stomach, you can't absorb calcium. So I told her, I said, why don't you drop the Tagamet, and why don't you, in fact, go to the health food store and buy some hydrochloric acid supplement, like beta-ene hydrochloride, and take it with your meals, because very likely your indigestion was due to the fact that you don't have enough hydrochloric acid. We need that for digestion. So she did it. She wasn't too happy about taking the chance. She thought she'd get an ulcer or something, you know. She did it, and her indigestion went away, and her bones have all come back. So fine. The other one was a doctor's wife who was only about 40 years old, 44, getting bored with life. He's a psychiatrist, so what can you expect? And just joking. There are some normal psychiatrists, but I've never met one, but I hear it. But at any rate, she was bored and complaining being tired all the time. Not tonight, dear, I'm too tired. And so he sent her to an endocrinologist who couldn't find anything wrong, but because she's a doctor's wife, he ordered a little tablet, meaningless dose of thyroid, you know. And she didn't get any benefit from the thyroid. Every time she raised the dose, her own thyroid would cut down by the same amount. You know, there's this negative cycle that we have, a way of controlling things. She was up to 6 thyroid tablets a day and still bored. And the trouble with the thyroid is that it stimulates the osteoclast to resorb old bone. She was resorbing her bone faster than the progesterone could make new bone. So she had kept all this information from me. I only found out that she had this high thyroid level because I did a blood test. And then I had to speak to her like a Dutch uncle, and I said, this is really stupid. You've got to cut down your thyroid. You're damaging your bones. And I finally got her to cut them out completely eventually. And the progesterone helped her so much anyway, she got better than that. But then her bones started to pick up. So this is where you have to be a doctor. And that's called the art and the science of medicine. You can't do it by cookbook, regardless of what your HMO tells you. You have to think once in a while. Next slide, next transparency. We're going to, I think, leave the subject of osteoporosis. You all understand now how to treat osteoporosis? It's no problem. When your progesterone is low, you need some progesterone, just as when your thyroid is low, you need a little thyroid. Okay, now I want to show you, the body makes progesterone. That's the molecule of progesterone. That's the one I put on the cover of my first book. This is the cholesterol molecule from which it comes. Now, the reason that I put that on the cover of my first book is that doctors are guilty of a semantic confusion. There are 2 words that we've used, progesterone and estrogen. Would you be surprised if I said there is no such hormone named estrogen? Does that strikes you as surprising? That's because estrogen is a class name, like the word apple is for apples. There is no apple named simply apple. There's Gravensteins and Delicious and Pippins and Macintosh, and every apple has its own name. Estrogen is that kind of word. There is no hormone named estrogen. There's a whole bunch of different estrogens, and they have different functions. Estriol is the one you make during pregnancy that makes your vagina so tough and your cervix so tough that you can have a 10-pound baby come through there and it all heals. And it does nothing for hot flashes because you don't make it when you're at that age. It does nothing for breasts either. It's neutral. There are very few receptor sites in the breast tissue for it. Whereas estradiol makes big breasts. You give it to men, and they make big breasts, and it's real good for hot flashes, but it doesn't do much for the vagina. So you got all these different estrogens, you see, but there's only one progesterone, and that's that bugger right there. That's the only one. Then you should know about hormones. Remember I said they're messengers? They're like keys to a lock. The molecular configuration has to be specific for each lock. Just like the key, if it has one little notch off someplace or one extra notch, it won't work for the right lock. So this is very important. Now we make it out of cholesterol. You see, cholesterol is kind of similar. And we make cholesterol, by the way, not by eating cholesterol. We make cholesterol from waffles and pancakes and maple syrup and starches and other fats and things. We don't make it out of cholesterol. Ford Motor Company doesn't make Fords by putting real Fords through their factory. They buy the parts. You see, they buy the parts. And that's called synthesis. In medical, scientific, biology, chemistry talk, that's synthesis. When you put things together from parts, you synthesize things. Now there's another semantic word we should clear up. Synthetic, the word synthetic. Synthetic means not only is it made by man, but it is made into something nowhere found in nature. You all remember a black comb that you might find on the sidewalk with the word ACE on it? You could look at all the plants in the world and all the animals in the world, and look in all the seas and every place you wanted to, and you wouldn't find one creature that made that comb. There's no comb making ACE combs. That is a synthetic product. Hormones we synthesize. That's a real product. That's made by nature. So it can never be called synthetic. It is synthesized. Now, back in the 30s when they discovered how wonderful progesterone was, one of the functions, by the way, is that it is made only in the second half of your cycle when you ovulate. And one of the functions is that it tells the other ovary that you're the other ovary, have successfully ovulated. It's like it's saying to the other one, relax, Charlie, I got one out, I win this month. And the other ovary stops. It stops the ovulation of the other ovary. That's why 299 out of 300 babies are single babies. Only 1 out of 300 are the fraternal twins. That's just by chance. Both ovaries release an egg at the same time. So one of the functions, is to stop ovulation. So the scientists were hired to go find some progesterone because the idea was if we could put this into the body ahead of time, each ovary would think the other ovary ovulated and we'd have the perfect birth control pill. Whoa. Evolution taking a big step here. So scientists were looking for other ways of getting progesterone. One way was to try to get pigs pregnant and to cut their ovaries out and squeeze out a little progesterone. Turns out it takes over 1,000 pigs to produce the amount of progesterone that's in that jar of cream. Not very commercially wise to do it that way. The French tried to collect all the afterbirth. When you're pregnant, your placenta makes a ton of progesterone. It makes 10 to 20 times more progesterone than the ovaries ever made. So the placenta has that. But the placenta has a ton of other stuff in it too. And it turns out when the French did this, they had to freeze dry it so it wouldn't spoil on them. They had to get it to a chemistry factory, a pharmaceutical lab of some sort. And then they had to try to separate out the progesterone out of all the other things that are there, the cortisol and testosterone and the estrogens and everything else. Found out it was very expensive and they couldn't compete either. But Dr. Russell E. Marker of the University of Pittsburgh in 1934 found some fats and oils in plants. He found it in the sarsaparilla bean, that he found a little 3 or 4 step chemical conversion, and he could convert a fat or oil in there into real progesterone. Same as we do. Same identical progesterone. Very commercially easy, but there weren't that many sarsaparilla beans on the market. So he looked around and he found that the Mexican wild yam, which is a tuber that grows in the ground, it's a big, ugly, black-green thing, very soapy and very fat-tasting. Turns out it's loaded with this particular fat. And you see how close it is to cholesterol. All they have to do is knock this off, have a double-bonded oxygen there in the methyl group, and take that hydrogen off there, and they've got progesterone. And there we have it, the same identical molecule. And in 1936, on a 2-acre plot, he grew some Mexican wild yams and was able to produce enough progesterone to satisfy the world's supply for a year. Isn't that amazing? And then he formed the Syntex Corporation, became the world's largest producer of hormones. And from that, they can make all the cortisones, all the testosterone, all the estrogens. They can even make digitalis out of it, all synthesized. But when they turn it into something other than Mother Nature made in any plant or animal, then it is synthetic. But we're not talking about the synthetic hormones. We're talking about that guy right there, synthesized. Next slide. You all understand that now? It's not in the beans. It's not in the Mexican wild yam. It is made from the Mexican wild yam. And in fact, that particular fat is found in over 5,000 different plants. It wouldn't matter to me if they made it from acorns or sunflowers or dandelions or anything that they wanted to. If it comes out to that same molecule, that is progesterone. And we call it natural progesterone because it is natural to humans. We had to do that because Premarin is called natural estrogen, isn't it? 48% of Premarin is estrone, which is one of the hormones natural to humans, but 52% are equals, which are natural only to horses. So 52% of Premarin are estrogens that are not natural to humans at all. They're natural to horses. Now, in the body, in addition to progesterone's function as the one that guarantees or optimizes the chance of a fertilized egg surviving, and for the embryo to survive and develop, and for the fetus to develop and last the whole 9 months until birth, you see, that's called gestation. From conception to birth is called gestation. The hormone that promotes that is the progestation hormone, progesterone. That's where it comes from. Isn't that so? In addition to that, our body uses it, just like the scientists do, to turn it into a corticosterone, to turn it into cortisol, to turn it into testosterone, and to turn it into estrone. It is the master precursor for all the other steroid hormones. Imagine what a fantastic hormone this is. You only make 15 or 20 milligrams at most by the ovary, but it becomes all these others, as well as doing all the thing it needs to do so that the species can reproduce. These down here at the bottom, by the way, this is Provera. See, they took progesterone, they added an acetate group, and they added a methyl group, and nowhere in Mother Nature is that hormone found. That is a synthetic hormone, and it's not the right key for the right locks, and it does a lot of bad things that progesterone doesn't do, and it doesn't do many of the good things that progesterone does. The only thing it does, it helps to hold in the bloody lining. So they can use it to help people's periods when you bleed. They can use it in birth control pills. This is the one that's more common in birth control pills, and you can see it's made from testosterone. They get the testosterone from male horse urine, and all they do is add this ethylene group right here, and now they have a pill that they call progesterone in birth control pills. It's crazy. It doesn't even look like progesterone. A con job has been pulled on the medical profession. This is my listing I've taken from several books on endocrinology on things that have been found that progesterone does. And remember, I said number one is procreation. It holds in the secretory endometrium. It helps the implantation of fertilized eggs, survival, development of the embryo, development of the fetus throughout gestation, restores libido. Restores libido. That's a surprise to people. Everybody thinks libido comes from the fact you have estrogen. Nonsense. It's testosterone and progesterone that does that. If you were Mother Nature and you wanted to get man and woman together to get a fertilized egg, which hormone would you put the libido on? The hormone that is there the week before the egg is made, or the hormone that comes when the egg is made? Right. Libido comes with the progesterone. Precursor role. It is the precursor to all of these hormones. Androstenedione, testosterone, estrone, estriol, all the corticosteroids, and aldosterone. This is the one that keeps your blood pressure right. Fantastic. Without progesterone, you can't make those hormones in the right amount. Then it does all these things over here. These are called intrinsic effects. We don't even know how progesterone does it all, but it's a mild diuretic, helps use fat for energy. It's a natural antidepressant. The brain cells require it. In fact, the brain cells concentrate at the levels 20 times higher than in the blood. The brain cells do work to pull the progesterone into them. It helps the thyroid hormone action because both of them helps to burn fat for energy, helps raise metabolic. Now, it even raises your temperature. When it increases your metabolic action, it raises your temperature. It's thermogenic. The Catholic Church knows this. The Catholic Church knows you can measure your body temperature every morning and you can tell when you are fertile. It's called the rhythm method. It normalizes blood clotting. This is important because in the nurses' questionnaire study, some of the nurses were on Premarin and estrogens of different sorts, and other nurses weren't. And they try to tell you that's good for the heart, but the reason that some of the nurses weren't on estrogen is because their doctors wouldn't give them any because they were overweight, diabetic, previously already had cardiovascular disorders, clotting disorders, and those are contraindications. So naturally those people have higher risk factors, and they are more likely to have a heart attack than those who are the skinny, non-cigarette smoking, tennis playing, healthy women who were given. So there was a slight difference. So I wrote to Dr. Kolditz, of one of the authors at Harvard, and I said, you were comparing different groups. How can you claim that one had a better effect on the heart than the other? He said, oh, well, we compensated for that difference. Yes, we recognize that those were risk factors, but we put in a correction factor and it still came out better. I said, where did you get the correction factor? Dr. Kolditz doesn't write to me anymore because he can't explain where he got the correction factor. However, he also can't explain why is it that the healthy, slim, non-cigarette smoking, tennis playing nurses were 43% more likely to get a stroke due to a clot. Whoa, that's in the study. It's not in the advertising material that the doctors get to read. It's in the study. 43% higher risk of getting a stroke due to a clot. Whoa. So that's why I say it's important that progesterone is found to normalize blood clotting. You don't get the strokes in. Normalizes zinc and copper levels. Those are the ones that turn a moderate irritation of a PMS woman into rage. When the brain has an imbalance of zinc and copper levels, irritation becomes rage. And in fact, you can get off a murder sentence if you can prove you have PMS and the rage was uncontrollable. Protects against fibrosis. It's even better than protecting against fibrosis. I have never had a failure yet in treating people with fibrosis. Within 3 months, the breast turned back to normal. Just like that. And the normal shows up in the mammogram. It shows up in the doctor's office when he examines you, when the person examines herself. Each doctor will say, what happened? And the patient said, oh, I took some natural progesterone cream. He said, what else did you do? Doesn't dawn on him. That was it. The progesterone turns the breast back to normal if you have fibrocystic breast disease. And it does it within 3 cycles. Then the women will call and say, now that my breasts are back to normal, can I quit the progesterone? I say, no, because your excess estrogen will cause more fibrosis again, so you just stay on it. And they say, how long? And I say, until you're 96, and then we'll reevaluate. Protects against breast cancer. I'll be talking about that a little more. I brought this up at the Santa Barbara conference last week, and somebody took me after the talk, made me meet Professor Formby, who is from Copenhagen, Denmark, and he's on a fellowship at Santa Barbara UC and doing research on this. And not only does it help prevent breast cancer, but he's a molecular biologist. He gave me 27 pages of references showing that estrogen dominance is the cause of cancer of the breast, cancer of the uterus, cancer of the ovary, and progesterone is the protector. And I'm going to explain all that if we have time at the end. Protects against endometrial cancer, ovarian cancer. He says everything you say has now been proven by the work that they've been doing there, plus around the world. He gave me some of the references are from France, some from England, some from China. It's all over the place. All the molecular biologists now have found the keys for those things, those proteins that turn a normal cell into a cancer cell. And that particular pathway is stimulated to go in that direction by estrogen and is stopped by progesterone. It restores normal sleep patterns. It's skin moisturizer. It's been sold for 40 years as a skin moisturizer. I have a hard time getting people not to use it on their face. I'm not against using it on their face, but I want people to use it on other parts of the body because some of the cream is not absorbed. Only the progesterone is absorbed, so some of the cream stays behind, and if they do it on the same spot, I have this worry that maybe it'll just be cream on top of cream. So by moving the sources around. And the right skin sites, by the way, are all the places where people blush. That's where the capillaries are more numerous and closer to the surface. So we're talking about the face, the neck, the chest, the breast, the arms, and the palms of the hands. Simple. You can do it elsewhere, but the absorption isn't quite as good. But on those places, it's so close to 100%. It's just unbelievably good. So that's why small amounts are all that are needed. And of course, it stimulates new bone formation. Okay? See how this has expanded? Started out with osteoporosis, and now we're talking about cancer, we're talking about water retention, we're talking about weight gain. You see, farmers know a lot of this. They are raising steers to get to a certain market weight, so you will eat the meat, right? They have found they have to remove the testosterone by castration, creating steers, so that they can give them estrogen, which causes rapid weight gain, water retention, which raises the weight, and fat. So they get the market weight earlier on less food, so it optimizes the profit of the man who's growing the steers for meat. But it ends up with steer meat that you eat by buying it sliced up at your grocery stores, which is loaded with estrogen. It's part of the estrogen sea in which we live. We live in a sea contaminated with doses of estrogen that you have a hard time imagining right now. This is part of an interesting study. This is now a year and a half old, but it was published in Fertility and Sterility, which is a major international obstetric gynecology issue. What they did, this is from Dr. D. Lignares from France. He's been writing about progesterone longer than I have. He's been doing it since the early 70s, saying how good it is for women's breasts in terms of mastalgia. That's a term means painful breasts, large painful breasts. And his colleagues would say, like they say to me, John, how do you know it's absorbed through the skin? How do you know it gets through the bloodstream? How do you know it gets to the breast where it's supposed to get, or to whatever the target tissue is? How do you know it reaches a concentration there that is meaningful? How do you know what it does? Well, we know because we see it in our patients all the time. You don't need rats. You don't need mice. You don't need cell cultures. We see it in our patients so that anybody could see it. The patient knows. That's why they tell other people, like my book sales. Warner has never spent a nickel on any advertising. Every book sale is woman by woman by woman, telling people about it. And they're in the 11th printing in less than a year. At any rate, this study by Dr. D. Lignares and Dr. Chang from Taiwan, they invited 40 young premenopausal women to participate in a study when they were going to have some benign breast surgery for some reason. They were going to have a breast surgery for some reason, and they said, we want you to participate in a study. We're going to give you a cream for 10 days, 8 to 10 days, that's all. Some of the creams will contain progesterone. You'll be getting 15 to 20 milligrams a day, normal dose. Some of the creams will contain estrogen, normal dose. Some of the creams will contain a little bit of each, 50% of each. And the other cream will be a placebo cream, no hormone in it. So here we had a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized, in vivo study. In vivo means in real living people. Not in rats, not in mice, not in cell cultures, in real people. They only did it for 8 to 10 days, and then they had their breast surgery. Now this is what happened. Down here, where it says placebo, that's the amount of hormone the women were making at that time of the month. They chose the time of the month before the egg production started. They chose the day 1 through day 8 during the period of their bleeding cycle so that their own estrogen and progesterone wouldn't show up. It was about 0.6 and 0.8. Then these are the ones who had the progesterone cream. They went up to 66. That's an increase of 100-fold. Increase of 100-fold by a little dab of progesterone cream. And these are the ones that were on the estrogen cream. That was also an increase of 100-fold over what the placebo cream users had. And the combination had 50-50, and that's what came out. 50-50 was found in the breast. Then they looked in the breast at the breast cell PCNA. That's the proliferating cell nuclear antigen. That is a small protein that is left behind when cells are multiplying. The word is mitosis. They were multiplying. One became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 8, and so on. This is a way of counting how fast the cells multiply. The definition of a cancer cell is that it is multiplying faster than a healthy cell, non-cancer cell, and it does not have time to fully differentiate into the mature cell that it's supposed to be. The more rapidly it multiplies, the less likely it's going to ever become the full cell. There's a beer called Full Sail beer, and I tend to mix it up with full cell development. And this is what happened. This is the multiplication rate on the people who had the placebo, and on the estrogen, the multiplication rate went up 220%. When estrogen was combined with progesterone, it brought it back down to the level of normal, and when progesterone was given by itself, it practically stopped the multiplication, the proliferation of the cells. The conclusion is, yes, it is well absorbed. Yes, it gets to the breast tissue in good concentration, just as the hormone made by the ovary does. Yes, it does affect breast cells. Yes, estrogen does make the cells multiply at an abnormally fast rate. And yes, progesterone protects. Isn't that beautiful? All in one study. Then they did one further study, and that is they looked for it in the bloodstream serum. Now, progesterone hormone by itself is fat soluble and will not mix with water. It carried in the blood on red blood cells and chylomicrons and other fatty things in the blood. And doctors are looking in the wrong place of the blood to measure the progesterone levels. People will say about the other study, well, that's all well and good, but how do we know it really protects against dying of breast cancer? Well, 1975, Dr. P.E. Moore in London talked the top 3 largest, best equipped, most advanced hospitals in London to participate in the study. On the day of surgery for their breast cancer, these women were measured for estrogen and progesterone levels, just on the day of surgery. Now they've been followed for over 18 years. And this is on women who have breast cancer with positive nodes outside of the breast. This is the worst kind. You have the breast cancer, and it has already spread to lymph glands elsewhere in your body. You understand what we're talking about? The worst kind. They didn't even measure the progesterone along the whole course of the 18 years. Just on the day of surgery. You see, there are 8 studies already that show that if your progesterone level is good on the day of surgery, you're less likely to have later cancer show up. Because at the time of surgery, they stir it up a little bit, you see, and the progesterone stops it from growing. So this is the study now, 18 years later. This is the survival rate of those people who had adequate progesterone levels at the day of surgery. Survival rate was about 70%, 73%, something like that. Okay? This is the survival rate of people who had less progesterone on the day of surgery. This is 100% higher than this. Their survival rate is in the 30s, 30%. The only difference between these two groups is the level of the progesterone on the day of surgery. Now, remember I said at the beginning that the only people I gave progesterone cream to initially for those first 3 years were people who couldn't take estrogen because they already had a history of cancer? Guess how many over the years now, since 1978 when I started, 19 years ago, guess how many have died of breast cancer among those people? 0. 0. Isn't that amazing? Now, either my patients, you know that 1 out of 8 women, by the time they hit 90, they should have breast cancer. And they do die. Not my patients that are on progesterone. They stay on it. I have no trouble with what's called compliance. I hate the word compliance. It applies to my dog. Will you be compliant? Obey me. No, I want patients who are challenging, who will argue with me, who will ask questions. I don't want to be compliant. But in the meaning of the word, are they using their progesterone? Yes. You can't stop them. I want them to stop once a month for 3 or 4 days just to let the receptors have a little rest. They don't want to stop for 3 or 4 days. They want their skin to stay good. They want to, and I say, it's in the fat under the skin. Don't worry. You can stop for 3 or 4 days. Next slide. But isn't this amazing? This was published in the British Journal of Cancer 5 months ago. Where's the medical profession? Don't they know that? Wouldn't you want to double your survival of your patients with a nickel's worth of progesterone? Why not? Now, this is from last month's issue of the American Family Physician. journal. I take a ton of journals. Since retirement, I've probably read more journals than any doctor you're going to run into, because I have to keep up, because I have to not make a mistake. Since, in effect, I'm criticizing conventional medicine, and I am. I want them to change. I want them to learn. I want them to grow. I want them to do the right thing. I have to be right. So I read a lot. So this, I didn't get it on here, but I have the page with me if anybody doubts it. It's from last month's issue of the Family Practice, Family Physician Journal. This is a list of steroid and pituitary hormones before and after menopause. Isn't it interesting? Here we have estrone, E1, the major estrogen we make, and it only drops from there to there, about 40%. It doesn't disappear. Your doctors will say, at menopause, your estrogen disappears. These doctors do not know what they're talking about. You're still making estrogen. You can make estrogen even if your ovaries are removed. You make it by body fat. In fact, an overweight, postmenopausal woman makes more estrogen than a skinny, cigarette-smoking, premenopausal woman does. You are not deficient. The question is, do you have enough or not? Now, he thinks you're deficient because you have some symptoms of estrogen deficiency. You might have hot flashes. You might have vaginal dryness, in spite of your own estrogen. The reason is that one of the functions of progesterone that I did not have listed on that, which I've learned now, is that it sets the sensitivity of estrogen receptors back to normal. When progesterone isn't there, the estrogen receptors don't work as well. It restores. These two hormones, even though they have opposing effects many places in the body, they actually work as a team. And the teamwork of progesterone in regard to estrogen is to restore normal sensitivity of the receptors. So when you add the progesterone to a woman who's postmenopausal, she frequently doesn't need any estrogen at all. It was always there. It just couldn't be heard by the body because the receptors were tuned down. Isn't that something? So here we have estradiol. That drops quite a bit. And that's the one that prepares the breast for breastfeeding. Now, after menopause, you're not going to be doing much breastfeeding. So naturally, that's the one that drops. But the one that is good for bones and everything is up there fine. And then this is, A stands for androstenedione. That's kind of a masculinizing hormone. And then T is testosterone, DHEA, cortisol, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. PRL is prolactin hormone, drops a little tiny bit. TSH, that's the thyroid-stimulating hormone, and GH is growth hormone. Of course, it's low to begin with. You have growth hormone only when you're very young. So not much changes at menopause. But you know what's fascinating about this list for the American family physician? Progesterone isn't on it. How can you expect the doctor to know anything about progesterone if you don't even list it on hormones change at menopause time? Does this strike you as strange? Unfortunately, it's all too common. If you read any article on osteoporosis, there will be no mention of progesterone. If you read any article on postmenopausal hormone replacement, there is no mention of progesterone. Here is a list for doctors on the change of hormones before and after menopause. We know that after menopause it drops to zero. Why don't they show the big drop? These are the diseases that women die of. You might be surprised. Women die of cardiovascular disease almost at the same rate as men. Now granted, they do it 20 years later, but they still die. And then of course cancer. We got in here breast cancer, endometrial cancer, ovarian cancer, all those things. Imagine where that would be if we could stop all those. You know that a study was done by the Johns Hopkins Medical Center starting in 1960s, extending for 20 years. It was published in 1983. They followed thousands of women, measuring their hormone levels, not treating them, just following them. And they found that the death, or the incidence even, the incidence of tumors, of cancer neoplasms, in those people who had adequate progesterone was only 1/10 of the other women. It cuts out 90% of all cancers. Now, Johns Hopkins is not Hennepin County. The journal it was published in is the American Journal of Epidemiology. That is not Reader's Digest. You understand? This is a good study by a good medical center, published in a good reference journal. And it disappeared without a ripple. That keeping your progesterone up has a good chance of preventing 90% of the cancers that would otherwise occur. You all follow that? Doesn't it strike you as strange that you didn't see that in the newspapers or anything? Are you beginning to get the picture that maybe there's a pattern here? Now, I brought this up because now we're going to talk about cardiovascular disease in women. This is just a list of the differences between, I'll take a moment to do this. The word for all these synthetic hormones, these look-alike mimics of hormones that are made by the pharmaceutical companies that are not found in any living thing, they are called progestins. That's the word for progestin. And I've been keeping track and adding to this list. These are obvious things. Progestins do the thing. It causes birth defects. You can look it up in the PDR. Any of the birth control pills, they'll list all the reasons not to do it, all the birth defects. Even in Provera, they list birth defects. If you give it to beagle dogs, it causes breast cancer. It's in the PDR, you know, the physician's desk reference? Every library has one. These things are all in there. These are all well known due to progestin. Not one of them is due to natural progesterone. Now here we get to protecting against cancer. That's progesterone. And that's not found over here. And regrowth of scalp hair, that's all here. All these have been found. Improves new bone formation. Well, Provera does a little bit. The studies show that it increases bone about 5% in 3 years, whereas real progesterone increases at 15%. So it's not surprising it has little. But here, increases the risk of coronary vasospasm. Bang-o. Decreases the risk, progesterone. So that's what I want to talk about next, is the heart business. There we go. This is from the University of Oregon at the Regional Primate Center. This is Dr. Hermsmeyer sent this to me. They just got this published, March of 1997. They were asked to study this enigma, this perplexity of women dying of heart disease. Prior to menopause, it's almost impossible to kill a woman with a heart attack. Doesn't happen. You have to be diabetic, hypertensive, a cigarette smoker, and grossly obese, and then it might happen. But a study of 2,000 consecutive deaths by women in Kings County in Washington found no premenopausal woman dying of a heart attack. Now, 10 years after menopause, you all start dying of heart attacks at a pretty good rate. And you get up to the rate that men do pretty fast. Now, the perplexity is that when you do the autopsies and look at the coronary arteries are not clogged up. At most, they have a 30 to 50% blockage of cholesterol plaque, whereas men have 90 to 95%. Just before I left for the airport yesterday morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, some lady called from Wisconsin. Her 44-year-old husband just had a big heart attack, and she wanted to know my thoughts about that. Of course, being in Wisconsin, he loved to drink milk, you know, all those terrible things that people do thinking they're doing it right. And this is an epidemic of men dying of heart attacks. Now, women are getting the epidemic when they're 65, 70, 75. But their coronary vessels are not clogged up with fat. So the working hypothesis is those blood vessels tighten up. And when they tighten up, a 30% blockage can be made into a 100% blockage. You all see that? Yeah. So we had to find what could make them to go into spasm. It's called vasospasm, spasm of a blood vessel. Turns out Dr. Hermsmeyer and his group had been doing angiograms, coronary angiograms, on rhesus monkeys. And they had found that they could picture the coronary arteries very good, very well with rhesus monkeys, and they had found a way to stimulate the artery to go into spasm. They had found a little trigger that would allow it, and they could then see, you know, how much it slowed down the flow of the blood. So they were asked to look into the business of women dying of heart attacks. Now, monkeys don't go through menopause. Do you know that? Until they die, they still have periods, can always have more babies. So they had to create menopausal monkeys. The way they did that was to remove their ovaries. And then they replaced the typical hormone replacement therapy. And then they tried another set of monkeys with estrogen plus a little progesterone, real progesterone, just like what I recommend. And in fact, Dr. Hermsmeyer wrote me a letter and said, were it not for your book, we wouldn't have thought of looking at the difference between progesterone and the synthetic progestins. Isn't that nice? That's why he sent me the results. This shows the progesterone monkey. This is the major coronary artery, like the anterior descending. Those of you whose husbands have had coronary arteries and angiograms, you know about the anterior descending artery. That's the major one. That goes to all the electronics in the heart. And then this goes down the left side, and so on. And then they gave a medicine to try to dilate it up as much as possible to make sure the monkey didn't have some spasm going on already. And so you can see that there's no change. It's identical, so that's fine. And then they gave the medicine that tried to make it go into spasm. And all they got was a slight reduction in caliber there, no spasm. So they gave a triple dose, a lethal dose to these monkeys, and that's as much of a spasm as they could create on progesterone. Then they took the monkeys that were on Provera, medroxyprogesterone acetate. First they did the dilating to see if it made any difference, and it's fine. Then they gave a single dose. Whoa. Those arteries closed right down and stopped the flow of the blood to the walls of the heart. And they followed the cardiogram of the monkey, and just before the monkey was about to die, they gave a reversing, and this is the best they could do to open it up again. They could not stop the spasm. They called it unrelenting spasm caused by Provera. Conventional medicine had already heard that this study was on the way. They had an answer. The answer was, oh, but those were monkeys. Conventional medicine was using pigs' hearts for study. Pigs' hearts have coronary arteries that do not ever constrict. We have arteries that constrict when we get a nasty letter from the bank. Or if somebody puts a little dent in our bumper. The pigs don't care. Their coronary arteries stay wide open all the time. It's conventional medicine that has been using the wrong animal model. The rhesus monkeys are like us in this regard. And this is what happened. Even when they tried to open up that artery again by giving an antidote, it wouldn't open. So, what conventional medicine didn't know was that Dr. Peter Collins in London, at the London Institute of Heart and Lung Research, has been studying the same problem in humans. He's been taking postmenopausal women, having them walk on a treadmill EKG, recording the cardiogram, finding out how much they can walk before they show any signs of ischemia. All follow that? No problem. Then he gives the women the typical estrogen and Provera, has them start walking, and bang, oh, they got to stop right away because the time for ischemia has been shortened way down. The heart is not being perfused with the right amount of blood because the coronary arteries go into spasm. So he took these same women and converted them to estrogen plus real progesterone. Now they're back to walking all day, and their hearts are fine. And this was published 2 months ago and was reported at the American Cardiology meeting in Massachusetts 2 months ago. Did you see the newspaper headlines about this? No? No. I think there is a pattern here. Nobody is telling anybody how good progesterone is. Nobody is telling anybody how bad Provera is and the other progestins. This is the explanation for the big rise of the heart attacks. And it doesn't have to happen just to the coronary arteries. It can happen to other arteries. How about Mrs. Harriman, 72 years old, our ambassador to France, on HRT, goes for a swim, has a massive stroke and dies. Wow, the Harvard Nurses Questionnaire study would have predicted that. This would have predicted it. Why wasn't she on progesterone? Doesn't anybody care about women dying? The question arose. You see, I don't think there's any question anymore that natural progesterone is a very important hormone. It is very easy to give by skin cream. It should not be given orally because the ovary never put it in anybody's stomach and it changes into other things and does not work. It goes well through the skin. It's a perfect delivery system. See, I don't think that's controversial. That's beyond controversy right now. These are facts.
I have been on natural progesterone and estrogen for the last 6 years.
As a cream?
No.
Oh, well.
I'm 61 years old,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
started taking this because of severe hot flashes at 55.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to stop the estrogen, but I would like to continue on the progesterone.
You
but
should,
you
but you
said
should
you
do-
should never take it orally. Why
right.
is that?
Because when it's taken orally, it's absorbed into the bloodstream and directly into the liver. In fact, even if it misses the liver the first time around, the blood circulation is every 20 seconds, so 3 times a minute goes through the liver. And this large amount, you're probably taking over 100 milligrams.
I have no idea. It doesn't.
You should know, because it's very important. You should not take more than 20 ever, and the doctors give 100 milligrams or 200 milligrams 2 or 3 times a day. Totally irrational, totally unnatural. And what happens is the progesterone molecule is converted into 3 different metabolites. That means a changed form. As it passes through the liver changes it into things that will mix with bile and conjugate and go out in bile. But these changed forms are not progesterone. One of them, in fact, binds to Valium, the same receptors in the brain that Valium does, and is so potent that it can be used as a surgical anesthetic.
So you're saying that too much progesterone can harm you also?
It can do funny things because it isn't progesterone that's harming you. It's the fact it's something that your body would never do, and you are creating products that are not progesterone. So yes, if you take too much orally or too much anyway, you can get some lack of progesterone effects and some sedating effects. And you should be using the normal physiological level, which is 15 to 20 milligrams a day as a cream.
But that could be gotten in pill form also, couldn't it? The
No,
natural?
I just said that when it's taken orally, 90% of it is changed into something else.
I had been on Premarin because I'd had a hysterectomy and then was diagnosed with breast cancer.
Right.
I am now on tamoxifen. They took me off the Premarin immediately. I'm on tamoxifen. I've been on it for a couple of years, and I've got 3 more years to go with it.
Yeah.
Could I use the progesterone?
Yes. Yeah, there's
cream?
no contraindication to progesterone no matter what. Are you still having periods?
No, I'd had a hysterectomy years ago. So.
She had a hysterectomy. The doctor's under the misconception that her ovaries are still making hormones. Tamoxifen works by competing with estrogen. Tamoxifen is a non-steroid estrogen. It's a weak action, and the idea is by having it bind to estrogen receptors, it'll protect you from your own estrogen. There's several things wrong with this. One is she may not be making very much estrogen. After hysterectomy, 80% of the blood to the ovaries has been tied off.
I have no ovaries. I mean,
I
they
have
took
no
everything,
ovaries, so she
I have
has
nothing. I have
so
nothing.
so she has no source of estrogen whatsoever except her body fat, and her doctor is giving her tamoxifen. The second thing wrong with tamoxifen is it is a strong enough estrogen to be classified as a cancer-causing agent because it causes cancer of the endometrium. Not very often, quite rarely, but still it is a cause of cancer of the uterus. She doesn't have a uterus, but it also causes blindness, it also causes liver damage, and now they're saying be sure not to take it more than 5 years. Well, they don't know that. Maybe it shouldn't be taken over 2 years. Or maybe, as most European doctors know, shouldn't be taken at all. She should be on progesterone. That would be the best protector for her so she doesn't have any recurrence of breast cancer. And here we have a lady who is on unopposed estrogen and gets breast cancer. Big surprise.
Two tumors in one.
Okay.
So.
Right.
So the
Anyway, you can
progesterone
use the real progesterone cream, and whether you use tamoxifen or not is between you and your oncologist and God. I personally have never used it in practice, and I've never lost anybody to breast cancer.
Yes, Dr. Lee. Your thoughts on Fosamax
Yes.
versus, taking
Right.
the natural progesterone cream?
All right, Fosamax, the question was my thoughts on Fosamax. Fosamax is the latest example of a group of drugs called bisphosphonates or bisphosphonates. These started, the major one was about 10, 15 years ago. It was sold as Didronel. The chemical name was etidronate. The new one is called alendronate, and it's sold as Fosamax. It is 1,000 times more potent than the others because it's bound to a protein. It becomes included in the matrix of bone, and it has a half-life of well over 15 years. Its function is that it stops the activity of osteoclasts. Remember the cells that eat out old bone, so the osteoblasts can come in and make new bone. By stopping osteoclasts, if you have such a potent drug, it is going to eventually stop all the resorption of old bone. There will be no places for new bone formation to occur. The osteoblasts can only work where the old bone has been cleared out. This is what has happened with all of the bisphosphonates so far. After 4 or 5 years of use, they quit working, and in fact, the hip fracture rates begin to go up, because the bone that you have left over is all the old bone that's been preserved because it hasn't been resorbed, hasn't been eaten away. And Fosamax is destined for the same disastrous result. The second problem with Fosamax is that it dissolves human cells. It eats out human cells. And the company itself says, be sure not to lie down after taking a Fosamax pill because it'll eat a hole through your esophagus or your stomach. They say it in a slightly different way. They say it'll cause severe esophagitis and gastritis. But there are now over 200 patients have had holes burnt right through their esophagus and their stomach. So there's no reason to take it. Also, third thing is there's no study that shows it's any better than a little bit of estrogen in slowing up bone loss. And so if that's what you need, a little bit of estrogen will be a whole lot safer, especially if you take it with progesterone.
Thank you very much.
So don't take Fosamax. Okay.
My question is probably fairly simple. Most of the talk today has been for those who are older. I felt like in menopause or after it. All the stuff that
My
you've been
talk is directed at
yeah.
people who are about age 35 and up.
Right, so that in other words, the use of the progesterone creams can be used for starting how young?
Whenever you detect signs of estrogen dominance, if you get thicker and fatter around your thighs and your butt and your lower abdomen and your breasts are swelling and you have less energy, you very likely are estrogen dominant. And you can have a progesterone level checked, and if it is low in the luteal phase, you should probably be adding progesterone. Because estrogen dominance is the enemy. And estrogen dominance can be treated with progesterone supplementation. And the only thing is you have to recognize it. In the book, you'll read the signs of estrogen dominance. A simple blood test for estrogen won't tell you, because estrogen dominance is only there relative to progesterone deficiency. So I would say that if a body is gaining fat, has large breasts, very likely estrogen dominance already exists. So a little progesterone would be a good idea, in my opinion.
Yes, you're talking about testing and monitoring. Where in this part of the country is there anything except a blinded allopathic doctor who's just going to laugh at you?
I don't know.
You have to be in the West Coast to find someone that'll test and...
We got the same problem on the West Coast, believe me. No. See, I don't think that your average family doctor is a lost cause. I think he's a bright, intelligent person who's overworked. I think with help you can teach him. And by doing, so you see, you don't need his approval. You don't need his, he doesn't have to say yes, he doesn't even have to say the dose, and I wish he wouldn't because he doesn't know the dose. What I want him to do is say, okay, I'll follow along with you and we'll see what happens.
But is he going to call for the tests? Is he going to monitor?
The only test you need
saliva test?
You don't need to monitor your saliva test. You know that postmenopausally, your saliva progesterone is going to be 0. So I never used the test. It didn't exist before I retired from active practice. There's no need to do it. It's only if you want to show him, if you're 35 years old and you want to settle the question one way or the other, that way you can do it. However, after menopause, you don't need the test. You just add the progesterone, and he can order an annual bone mineral density test.
I've done a bone density, and I've got a problem.
Yeah, well, of course. But now you go on progesterone for a year and use up a half a jar a month, like my patients did, learn the diet, read the book, do what I say in the book in chapter 12, and then a year from now get another test.
Okay, can I ask one more portion of this? Years ago, I'm way past menopause. After a pap smear test came back, there was a little notation that my estrogen was zilch. And so you're talking about estrogen dominance. Well, there's not much lower than
zilch. I know. It's because for the estrogen to work, it has to have active estrogen receptors. And by adding the progesterone, the estrogen receptors return to normal function. And that would help. If it doesn't, then I'm not against a woman adding a little estrogen. But the amount you need is only about 1/4 of how much is made by the Perman folks and the folks that make estrace. They make too much. You see, I have to teach the people to break the pills in half or take them every 3rd day or something to get the right amount. Or get some Perman vaginal cream and use just a tiny little dab twice a week. There's all sorts of ways of raising the estrogen a little bit.
Okay. Well, no, the last part of my question is, how do you test for hydrochloric acid?
How do you get hydrochloric acid?
How do you determine, without taking something that's going to give you heartburn to stay up all night? You know, I mean, how do you find... Your allopathic doctor says, oh, do this, do that, and if you have a problem, oh, who wants a problem?
Yeah. There are 3 ways. One is to put a tube down your stomach and suck some of the fluid back and have it measured. And that's not a very happy experience to do. And the second way is to swallow a radioactive capsule that gives off a signal, depending on the amount of acid in your stomach. And you have to wait for you to pass it later in the BM and retrieve it because it's very expensive. And you don't want to do that too. The way I did was to see, I would ask, are there foods that you can't eat now that you used to eat and have no problems with? And they say, oh, yeah, if I eat such and such, I get all this indigestion and gas. I said, well, why don't you go to the health food store and buy a little hydrochloric acid like betaine hydrochloride and try it with each meal and see what happens. And if they call back and say, whoa, now I'm fine, I can eat that food, everything's fine, then I say, good. And if they say it didn't make any change, then I say, well, then it's not the hydrochloric acid.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
All right.
Hi, I'm an electrolysis. I absolutely love the product. I got addicted like 10 days. My varicose veins are better. My fibrocystic breast, I had 40 notable nodes. After 2 weeks, I only have 4 left.
Good.
I have about 2 or 3 questions. Last year I was laid up with a sciatic nerve problem, and I was using the progesterone cream. I think I had stopped during that time, and when I had a test, the bone density test, taken, I had lost 10% of calcium. Will the progesterone cream make that up gradually?
Yep.
It will?
Yeah, gradually. As you saw those charts, each year they gained 3 to 5% more bone, and in 3 years they had 15% more bone. They come back.
Okay, because the doctor had given me a list of medical treatments, and one of them that he recommended was calcitonin, which is a nasal spray.
Yes.
And I think that I still want to just stay with the cream. I wondered if you knew anything about this.
Yeah, calcitonin is a hormone made in salmon by their pituitaries. And the salmon that are caught, they have their heads cut off and the pituitary taken, and then they make it, and it used to have to be given as injections to people, and now it's a nasal spray. Calcitonin in humans is made by our thyroid gland. Isn't that interesting? It's a hormone that has to do with calcium metabolism made by our thyroid gland. Now, the science of it is many women have had their thyroid glands removed. And these women are only being given thyroid replacement hormone back again, right? So these women are all deprived of calcitonin. Guess what happens to their bones? Nothing. Osteoporosis is not due to calcitonin deficiency, never has been, never will be, and giving calcitonin will only sponsor a little more bone growth for the first couple injections, first couple months of use, and then the body readjusts to it and the effect disappears and you lose the bone you gained and you're back to where you were. The only thing that's happened is the pharmaceutical industry has taken some money from you in the process. So I've never used it and I've never seen a need for it.
My last question is, where can I go to find a gynecologist that is up to speed on the things that you're speaking about, and also get a physical examination without having to have hormone replacement therapy pushed on them?
Yeah. I don't know. You have to educate your gynecologist. One of my friends in California was head of the OBGYN staff at our local hospital, and super guy, and he began using it, and he had all the benefits that I had described, and then he had a stroke, major stroke, and he's out of practice. He was also president of the medical society and chief of staff at the hospital, and he'd been running a committee trying to get these third-party payments and HMOs and all this going. I went to see him when he had his stroke, and he couldn't talk, the poor guy, and he hasn't been able to return to practice. And finally, I understood him to say that he's the first victim of what is that name that they use for describing HMOs and all these things? Managed care. He's the first victim of managed care. He didn't manage his own life right and had a monster stroke. No, it's a big problem. You will have to get your exams from your family doctor or internist, but tell him to read the book. I got a call last week from an OBGYN in Chicago, and he says his sister finally made him read the book, and now he's been doing it, and it happened that patients came in that fit the category of estrogen dominance and progesterone deficiency. He said it worked just like you said. All the things in the book work just like you say. And I said, well, thank you very much. That's nice to hear. He said, well, I have a big problem. I said, what's that? He said, I'm part of a 6-man group. He said, the other 5 don't know anything about this. I don't know how to talk to them. He said, it's changed my mind so much, they don't understand even what I'm talking about when I talk about natural progesterone. And I said, well, maybe by osmosis or maybe by contact. You've got to hope that they can open up their minds the way yours was. But they have to see it. You know that most of the decisions and conclusions in medical care did not come from peer-reviewed placebo-controlled trial. They came from simple observation by intelligent people. That's how they come. The rest of it is minor, and you can get very false results from very well peer-reviewed studies. And in fact, this happens almost as often as you get a good study. Okay.
Are you aware of any negative effects from taking progesterone through cream?
Well, I have patients who told me to warn people of one thing.
Okay.
It restores libido back to normal.
Oh, okay.
So the guy across the room gets a little better looking. It doesn't turn anyone into a sexual pervert or do anything like that. It's not beyond your control, so don't blame me for anything that happens. But they say people ought to be warned that good old libido comes back again.
So let me I just am curious because if you gain weight in your thighs and your stomach because you're lacking in progesterone, will you lose it when you start taking this?
Yeah. See, estrogen is a survival factor for women. It takes the food you eat and turns it into fat for storage. So when a true famine comes, you will outlive the men. All right? But when you're pregnant, you have to have a way of utilizing this stored energy. And that way is progesterone. It allows your body to use your body fat for energy now. For every pound of body fat that you metabolize, you get 4,000 free calories worth of energy. Isn't that marvelous? This is why during pregnancy you have the energy to carry 2 lives.
I also have a couple of questions. You had that list that the progesterone was supposed to help was it for breast cancer and all? I mean, for people that have had breast cancer and they could take it carefully and without any side effects. And also, another friend asked me a question. She took the replacement therapy and she got phlebitis and blood clots. And she wanted to know if this would be perfectly safe and if there are any studies that have been done on it to show her that.
Yeah, estrogen causes a stickiness of the blood and causes the blood clots.
Okay.
Right, and progesterone helps prevent it.
It would prevent it?
I mean, if she got kicked by a horse and got a blood clot in her leg, well, I can't stop that.
No.
But yes. As far as the breast cancer business, I didn't have time to include in the talk, but I want to show you something. You see these? 27 pages of various papers, all of them showing the same thing. One is from China, one is from France, one is from England, a couple of the United States, and they all show the same thing. They all have to do with the cancer cells that originate in the breast, the uterus, and the ovary. They are all found to become that way because of a metabolic pathway involving something called apoptosis. You all know what apoptosis is? Apoptosis means programmed cell death. You are constantly rejuvenating your body. You're growing hair, you're growing skin, you're growing bone, the lining of your sinuses, the lining of your lungs, the lining of all the glands, all the milk ducts, everything else. The cells are made continuously, they live a certain life, and then they're supposed to die. You only can keep healthy by the cells having programmed death, and that programmed death is called apoptosis. If they do not die, if they just age and they hang around and they can't do what they're supposed to do, they revert to a more primitive pattern and they become a cancer cell. So the things that promote apoptosis save you from cancer. The things that promote cells not to have apoptosis promote the cancer. All of these have to do with that. They know the genetic things that are driving it. It's a thing called P53 and another thing called PCR2. So they know by the balance of that whether something that you're taking is promoting a cancer cell or something is preventing a cancer cell. All these studies show the same thing. Estrogen promotes the stopping of apoptosis. The cells become older. The cells change into cancer cells. Progesterone promotes apoptosis and stops the proliferation of new cells. So progesterone protects against cancers. So all of these that are estrogen-dominant tissues, they're all protected by progesterone. Isn't that amazing?
Dr. Lee, thank you. I've been on it 3 months, and I've noticed significant differences in my PMS problem. I'm actually livable with my family and myself. There's no more blood clotting in my periods.
Yeah. But it will get better and better over time.
And I just, in 3 months, I've noticed the difference.
Great.
I have one question. My daughter is on dexamethasone. She is getting no periods to irregular periods.
Right.
Adrenal gland failure, I think she has. I think that's what it's her.
You see, progesterone is the precursor to all the adrenal gland hormones.
So she should take this?
If she were my daughter, I'd put her on progesterone and I'd decrease the dexamethasone.
Okay. I just wanted to say I'm a compounding pharmacist in Newington, and things are changing. I spent 20 years reassuring women that their Premarin and Provera were, you know, they...
So did I.
And
so I did it for 20 years.
Until about a year ago. I spent a lot of time reading, and I'm now in the process of trying to educate the physicians in the area. They are listening, and it's because women are driving the ship. You're not happy with the response that you've gotten from recent medical therapy, and I think only about 15% of women are on
Let me give you,
therapy.
How many of you read Susan Love's book? Yeah. She doesn't know a thing about progesterone, and she's a surgeon, so she's unlikely to. But she does know that all this estrogen is not good. And she says women are inherently very wise. Of all the prescriptions written, the majority of the women don't even bother to get them filled. And of those that get them filled, they stop within a year. And in the long run, only 15% of women who get a prescription actually continue the prescription. Their body is telling them. Isn't that your experience too? Yeah. No, that's great. I think it's great, and you're going to see the results on the patients.
Well, we have already with many patients. But my question is specifically estriol.
Yeah.
A lot of in the literature today about that actually being protective.
It's protective against breast cancer, and it's wonderful for the vagina. I looked up all the references I could find, and I found a beautiful reference in 1979, Dr. Lindsay. It's the effect of various estrogens. Remember I said there's a variety of estrogens? The effect of various estrogens on bone, mineral. And they found estradiol was there, and estrone works, mostly because estrone becomes estradiol. Estriol didn't do a thing for the bone. So I have to tell people in menopausal life that they shouldn't take estriol as the only estrogen. They maybe could take it along with some estradiol or estrone, but it hasn't been found to help bones, because it's the one that you make during pregnancy when you can take the minerals from the mom's bone for the baby to use. So it allows the minerals to leach out of bone. That's my conclusion. Otherwise, it's a marvelous hormone. Okay.
Hi, I've been on Fosamax for almost a year. Can I start the progesterone cream at the same time as now?
Now you're on what?
Fosamax.
Fosamax, yeah.
Yeah. The study will be done in about 2 months.
Okay.
And I didn't know whether I should
You
start
bet. Start the progesterone yesterday.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, right. It won't interfere with the Fosamax, but the Fosamax will interfere with bone building 8 years from now.
Okay.
10
Well,
years.
it's a study, and I figured, well, I want to find out if this is any
Well, yeah.
I've got 2 months left for a year.
Yeah. Entering a study is...
But I can use the cream right now.
Absolutely. Might save some bone. And you might get some... But you see, new bone building only occurs at the site where you've resorbed away the old bone. Isn't that clear? I mean, everybody knows that. And the damn Fosamax gets into the matrix of the bone and doesn't get out of the body. It may remain active for 15 or 20 years, in which case there won't be any more resorption of old bone. Therefore, there won't be any more new bone building, and you'll end up with a skeleton full of old bone.
In other words, stop the Fosamax.
I would.
Yeah.
But
well, I figure I'll give him a chance.
Okay.
2 months left.
All right.
And see if it does any good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi. I don't like these microphones. I had a lot of questions. Most of them were answered through this session. But the last question I have is, I've had problems.
There you go. See, that way it gets recorded for posterity.
Thank you. Since I was an early age, I was put on birth control. I've been on it for 14 years. Stopped last month.
Good.
One of the things that was done many years ago was started with the antidepressant drugs, because I am one of those that will need a plea for murder because I have some problems with PMS.
Right.
How quickly do you anticipate progesterone to?
All right.
When do I stop the antidepressant and comment?
Okay. PMS treatment is the most difficult of all. PMS is a syndrome, which merely means a collection of symptoms and we don't know diddly about the cause. That's what a syndrome means. We can get enough people to agree that if you have this set of symptoms at this time of the month, then we'll all call it PMS. But nobody knows what it is. Isn't that amazing? It's premenstrual distress of some sort, and it's no fun to have. It's a terrible thing. Now, my patients, I took those that gained weight, water retention, during the last week or 10 days of the monthly cycle. Those were the ones I could guarantee would respond to progesterone. And I would start the progesterone day 12 with a nice dab on the face, the neck, the chest, the breast at night for 4 or 5 days. Then I would go to a dab twice a day, and then the last 4 or 5 days I'd double that dab and make a huge dose the last 4 or 5 days, because there's no way to measure how much to use, and you just find the dose by increasing. I call it the crescendo pattern. And then stop on day 26. And if that wasn't enough, then do more and find the dose that works. Then once you gain control over PMS, then you can back down on the dose because your cortisol levels will subside. And then you can reduce the dose of your antidepressant as you yourself determine. I don't know any way that somebody else can, but when you begin to feel better, you can reduce. There's no reason they can't be used together. No problem. No problem. And eat a plant-based diet and take magnesium and B6. Read my book. Follow the rules. But don't be afraid to use some progesterone in good amounts the last few days. All right. Well, thank you very much. You're very patient.
For more information about Natural Woman Progesterone Cream, which is recommended by Dr. Lee, contact the healthcare professional or firm providing this video or call Products of Nature.